Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jim Anderson. I'm the spring wheat breeder at the University of Minnesota, based in St. Paul. So the cover slide here, that's our new plot combine that was purchased by the Minnesota Ag Experiment Station. And to finance it, we basically rent it. So we're paying roughly $10,000 a year or so to harvest our plots on the St. Paul campus with it. Other crops are also using it, so it gets a lot of hours on it. So this is the first year with it. We really like it because it weighs the grain for each plot. So we have yields immediately. I have yields the next day if I want with moisture content. So it's gonna be really great for our project. So this is co-authored with Joachim Wiersma, based up in Crookston. I think most of you know Joachim. So this is very similar to the talk that was at Prairie Grains in Grand Forks if you attended there. So a rundown of U of M releases. I'm going to talk about all varieties and important characteristics, but just to kind of calibrate you and remind you of what our program has released in the last few years. So I'll go back to Linkert 2013. Linkert was the most popular variety for a 5-year stretch. It's finally been supplanted by some other varieties, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Bowles, our high protein variety. Shelley is still hanging around. It's got some area, I think up Thief River Falls area, it's still fairly popular. Lang kind of crashed and burned, didn't really get off to a good start. Washburn got up to like 4% of the acres and died off. Torgy kind of surprised us. It was #1 wheat variety in the state last year. I think it had a pretty good year this year as well. It did in our trials. And our newest release is MN Rothsay, so I'll be talking quite a bit about the characteristics of that variety. It was in seed increase last year, so this year will be certified seed production. Thanks. Okay, so every year the Minnesota Wheat Growers does a variety survey. It's very valuable information to me as a breeder to see what farmers are growing. Kind of gives us an idea of what characteristics are important, and also what varieties we think we may want to try to replace. So it kind of helps target our breeding program, breeding for specific traits. So last year, Torgy was #1. So the green is 2022 acreage, red is 2021, and blue is 2020. So these are in order of the green, the 2022 acreage. So you can see kind of what the trends are. This Westbred variety's been on the way up the last few years. Valda on the way down, still #3. Westbred 9479 on the way down. Murdoch took a big jump up in 2021, but then Murdoch did not like the heat and the dryness of 2021, so its acreage stabilized, and it did have a very good year in 2022. Linkert is definitely on its way out. Shelley kind of hanging in there a little bit. All right, so every year we have about 7-8 varieties that we're testing for the first time. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to send out an email to all the seed companies, all the other universities that have spring wheat genetics to test, and we'll offer to test those materials. For the private companies, we charge $1,500. That gives you all the data from all these locations, which is really a bargain. We should probably increase that price a little bit to be more in line with what other universities charge, but we've been at that rate for a while. So we have Ascend from South Dakota State, CAG Recoil, Champions Alliance Group, a Cropland, a couple of Lima grains, Rothsay from our program, Meridian Seeds, and Indy Heron from NDSU. For some of these, we'd had them tested as an experimental for maybe 1 or 2 years before. So for some of these, most of these, you'll see 1 year of data. For some, you'll see 2, and for something like Rothsay, we've obviously had it for 3 years or more. So you'll see full data on Rothsay. All right, I'll start out with yield. So I'm going to show you slides like this for yield, protein, straw strength, and a couple of diseases. Just kind of hit what I think are the main ones that are driving variety choice. So this is yield from northern locations only, which we define as pretty much I-95, I-94 and northward. These are shown here based on their 2022 yields in bushel per acre, and then we have 2-year and 3-year data. The 2-year data I think is a little funky because 2021 was a very poor year. The heat, the dryness at almost every location. The yield data was not very good. I don't think it was really representative. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock into the 2-year data. Look more at 2022 and also the 3-year data. So what I'm going to do on all of these slides is all of the newer varieties, so the ones that were on that last slide, are highlighted in bold. So if you're looking for how those newer varieties are performing, look at the bolded ones and see where they're shaking out. So there's some of the newer ones that are in the top yield group here: MS Charger, Ascend SD, Race, CAG, Justify. So there's, we've got some good genetics coming along for yield, is what that's telling me. Where do some of the more popular varieties fall on this? Here's W9590, so kind of above average yielder. WB 9479, kind of on the lower side. Not as low as a Linkert, but definitely on the lower side. Valda is usually in that top group. There's Valda, there's Shelley. So just as a basis of comparison. All right. And protein, obviously very important characteristic. So I've got protein here and also the baking quality. This is a ranking that I put on based on data that we get from a USDA testing lab. So they'll bake a loaf of bread on it, look at the loaf volume, the gluten strength. So, and not every baker would rate these the same. And I go to a wheat quality council meeting in Kansas City every year. Different milling companies, baking companies will tell us how they like our different varieties. They won't all rank them the same. But this is my personal ranking based on the data. It's based on protein content, gluten strength, loaf volume, and water absorption. Those are kind of the 3 main characteristics. So 1 is best, 9 is worst. Quite a range in protein content. Those Lima grain varieties, Trigger, Buster, they're down on the bottom. When grown on your farm, you would probably struggle to get a 12% protein on Trigger or Buster. These on either the university ground or our farmer cooperators, they're pretty good nitrogen rates. So we don't see too many proteins below 12%, but that definitely is a consideration with those varieties. All right, I think I'll point out here's Race, kind of a mid-protein variety, and Torgi is going to be over here a little bit higher up. Race, I would say a 5 for quality. I would call that acceptable. I'm not sure we'd want to release anything that's much worse than that. Half of our wheat is exported. So we need to keep those markets in mind. They're paying for that protein and the quality, that baking quality that's often associated with that high protein. So we're trying to maintain those standards. I will point out, so some of the top varieties that we've been growing recently, so Linkert is excellent quality. So the millers, the bakers have been very happy with that one. WB 9590 is pretty good quality. It's actually very good protein for where it is yield level wise. And 9479, it's a little bit lower protein. Where is it on there? Top of column 1. Right in the bowl, so the second one. Oh yeah, even higher protein. That's a good quality variety as well. So we've been growing pretty good quality wheat in the state for many years. So I'd like to keep that going as much as possible. All right, I always show some sort of slide of yield versus protein. Don't put too much stock into the exact position because this is only 3 locations. So 2022 was a challenging year for harvest for us, especially for the on-farm locations. We had equipment breakdowns, we had personnel issues, and so the long and short of it is we didn't get test weight or protein on all of the on-farm samples. So we've just got these 3 where we had full yield and protein. So it's only based on 3 locations, but it's the typical pattern where the higher protein varieties are the higher yielding varieties are the lower protein, and vice versa. And what we really want are varieties in this quadrant. We've got, AP Smith is kind of in there. I would say W9590 is probably as strong into that quadrant as any variety, but that's definitely something to look for and be aware of that negative correlation between yield and protein. All right, straw strength. This has been a big driver in selection for our breeding program for the last dozen or so years, to the point where we probably won't release anything that's even a 5. We're probably going to have only 4 or better. I would say Torgy is kind of on that borderline. If I had to put a decimal place on Torgy, it would probably be like a 4.4. And this last year, it was a high-yielding year. You probably saw a little bit of lodging on Torgy in places. Whereas Rothsay, I was on the fence of whether that's a 2 or a 3. And I was waiting until we got this year's data to make that call. Rothsay would be like a 2.6, so it gets rounded to a 3. So it's close to Linkert, not quite there, but I would say it's definitely the equal, if not better, than all of these other ones that are rated as a 3. And so that's kind of the point I wanted to make here. Is you see Rothsay as a 3, Torgy as a 4. If you had lodging on your Torgy, if you had Rothsay, I bet you wouldn't get any lodging. So there's, even though it's a 1-point difference, it's closer to a 2-point difference. There's just some rounding error in trying to squeeze this all into a 1 to 9 rating. And I don't like to make it too complicated by having, a more convoluted scale. The ones that are a half, so 3.5 or a 4.5, they'll get a rating of either one of those 2. So the 2.5s will either go to a 2 or a 3. The 3.5 will be a 3 or a 4. We just need more data to push it in one of those directions. So there's a lot of good choices. I would say anything 4 or less in most years is going to be fine. Nothing lodged in 2021, so we got no data in 2021. 2022, we had quite a bit of differential lodging, so that really helped us out assigning these values. Scab, still our most important disease that we've got to be aware of. The fungicides are better than they were in the old days. Caramba, Prosaro, Miravis Ace is a newer one. Reduce damage by as much as 70%. That's kind of in a best case scenario. I would think in terms of 50, 60% symptom reduction in most scenarios. The optimum timing is beginning of anthesis, so Feek's 10.51, but you can go up to 5 days later and get similar levels of control. So that window of timing, especially with Miravis Ace, is a little wider than it used to be. So before Miravis Ace, it was maybe a couple of day window. Now you've got almost a week to get the product on. Where are these new varieties shaking out? We've got some 4s among the new group. We've also got some higher values, 5s. AP Smith is a 6. And a bunch of the newer ones, we don't have enough data yet. We probably need 1 more year of data. This is all coming only from our inoculated misted nurseries at St. Paul and Crookston. None of this is non-inoculated. because we want to be sure that there's good inoculum pressure throughout the heading period for all these varieties. There's almost a 2-week difference between the earliest and the latest heading variety. So if we tried to collect this data based on a non-inoculated trial, it would be skewed towards when the inoculum was in the, flying around and when that particular variety was heading. So just too much, the data would be too convoluted by heading date. So all of these are getting a kind of a fair test when we do the inoculation. We're controlling the inoculum production. So it's a high disease environment. So it's a pretty rigorous test. And my recommendation is still try to pick varieties that are in this 3 to 4 range. If you're picking the 5, 6, 7s, you probably want to be sure to get a fungicide on. In most years, it's probably going to pay off to put fungicide on those guys. And I have to point out these West breds are about as bad as anything out there still for scab. We're probably getting by with the fungicides okay, but if we get a really good year that sets up for a lot of scab, those varieties, in my mind, are quite risky. So these are as bad as stuff that we were growing in the early 90s. Okay, next, bacterial leaf streak. This is the other disease that's been a big focus of ours. Mostly because there's no other control options. You're at the mercy of Mother Nature and the variety that you're growing. There's nothing cultural, no chemical that really does a good job on this. So we've been rating this in natural conditions mostly. We also have inoculated trials, which in the past haven't correlated as well as I would like with what we see in a natural condition. Because just spraying the bacteria on, there's also often some sort of a irritant carborundum that kind of breaks into the cells to try to get that bacteria in. I think our procedures are better now. Ruth Delmacki has been doing the inoculated trials. We're getting better correlations what we see in the field, but still all of this data is from natural inoculation in the field settings. In 2022, we did get quite a bit of bacteria, so we do have some kind of a rating on all of these guys. In 2021, we had no data, so 2022 is good to see some of that disease. The ones that I've got rated as a 2 or a 3, you should not have any significant problems. Anything rated as a 2, that's getting near immunity, and it's hard to even find any disease at all on them. 4 or a 5, yes, we see disease, but it's maybe not as much or not as consistent. The 6s and the 7s and Gunsmoke is an 8. An 8 would tell me that that's as bad as any variety in that trial, just about any time we see the disease. So Gunsmoke is a risky one, but any of these that are 6 or higher, you're probably at some significant risk of getting damage from that disease. And tan spots. And often I don't show a slide just for tan spot or septoria, but we saw quite a bit of this last year. In some cases, if there's both tan spot and bacterial leaf streak, I don't take the time to try to differentiate between the two. I'll just do a green leaf rating. Maybe I'll come back in a couple of weeks and look at it again and decide, okay, was this more tan spot or more bacterial leaf streak? And I don't try to differentiate between tan spot and septoria, but generally the tan spot is going to have a dark center on it, and the septoria is usually going to be a lens shape without that dark center. But the experts that work on both of these diseases tell me they can't always distinguish them apart in the field. So me as a breeder trying to rate 200 varieties in the field, I'm not going to slow down and try to make that designation. I'm just going to make a quick 1 to 9 rating. So we got some pretty good differences here. We go from a 3 all the way down to a 7. Again, the West bred varieties are weaker on most diseases. Some of the newer varieties are pretty good. 3s and 4s, I would say very little damage. You probably don't need a fungicide. I know a lot of you put on a fungicide at a 3 to 5 leaf stage with your herbicide. That'll keep it at bay, but this year we saw a lot of it coming back after heading time on the flag leaf, quite a bit of these diseases there. In that case, a second application or your fungicide application that you're using for scab would tamp this down as well. So the control is really no different for either, whether it's tan spot or septoria. The only concern would be if we started getting fungicide resistance, which I don't think we've really seen in this region. Septorias in Europe have evolved resistance to a lot of the fungicides. So if we started seeing that, that would be alarming. But I don't think we get enough septoria to worry about that. So you can kind of treat these two, whether it's tan spot or septoria, as the same, and that's how we're rating them too. So last trait, pre-harvest sprouting. So we all remember low falling numbers. What year was that? 2019, I think, or was it 2020? Years are running together for me. I think 19 was the big year for low falling numbers. So that is related to pre-harvest sprouting. So if you have sprouted wheat, it is going to give you a low falling number, but you can get low falling numbers in the absence of sprouting. And the conditions that cause that is a cool temperature. So if we drop down into the 40s in August, late in grain fill, some varieties are genetically predisposed to give a low falling number. And the phenomena is called late alpha amylase. So it's enzymes that kick in response to that cold, it's essentially a cold shock that grain is getting. So we did get some data back in 2019 on which varieties were showing lower falling numbers. Now we haven't gotten any data since then on falling numbers, so we still have our pre-harvest sprouting. So this is your best proxy, really, to try to avoid falling number issues. Anything rated as a 1, they're about as good as we can get. So this is, we harvest the spikes, we put them, dry them down, throw them in the freezer till we're ready to assay them. We assay them by putting them in a dew chamber for a week and then see what sprouts. So the ones that are 1s, they basically don't sprout after a week under 70-degree perfect moisture conditions for sprouting. Something that's a 4, it may have maybe 25-30% of the seeds have sprouted. There's maybe coleoptiles that long on some of them. So it does differentiate fairly good. The 1s and 2s I don't worry about. The ones that are 3, okay, maybe you should be concerned. 4s, maybe if you're worried about sprouting and low falling number, these may be guys to avoid. And compared to our other scales, so everything's on a 1 to 9 scale, a 4, 4 for scab is pretty good, right? That's moderately resistant. A 4 for pre-harvest sprouting means you're among the worst. And the scale is such is because there are other wheats, like a white seeded wheat, that would be your 7s and 8s and 9s. So white wheats inherently don't have as good pre-harvest sprouting tolerance. We don't have any growing in the region right now, but if we do, they would be 5s or higher for the most part. So if you really want to grow one of these that is rated as a 3 or a 4, I would watch the weather closer to harvest time. If storms are coming in, it looks like we may be wet for a while, maybe early morning mist, maybe try to get those varieties off the field first, even if you have to dry them a little bit, just to avoid that risk. Your 1s and 2s, they can probably stand and take that rainstorm and not have any adverse effect. All right, finally to our picks. So Joachim and I always discuss these. It kind of answers a lot of questions on what we think are kind of the best genetics that are out there. So this year, this is the criteria. It has to be tested at least 3 years. It has to be less than or equal to a 5 for FHB and bacterial leaf streak, less than or equal to a 3 for pre-harvest sprouting, and less or equal than a 6 for quality. So nothing bad quality, nothing terrible for diseases. All of these guys on here happen to be 3 or a 4 for both BLS and FHB, so we didn't even get any that worked to that 5 stage. So we've had 3530 on this list for a while, for many years. So that's a cropland variety. It's fairly tall. So if you do have a market for straw, that would be one to consider. It is a weaker lodging wise and a little weaker on leaf diseases, but nothing you can't take care of with fungicide. Driver is a South Dakota variety. It's yielded well, also a little weak on lodging and quality. Dynagro has one ambush that we've had on this list for a while. It yields fairly well. Rothsay is on here. The only real negative would be that quality is kind of borderline. The protein is okay, but the milling and baking quality is just okay. Torgy is balanced variety, decent protein, decent yield, no real negatives as far as all of these characteristics. SY611 CL2, so this is a Clearfield wheat from Syngenta. So this is a IMI herbicide. I don't know if there's a whole lot of acreage of this one. I didn't look at the numbers. It's definitely less than 5%. But if that's something that fits into your crop rotation and the type of weeds you have and your herbicide rotations, it could be something to consider. And Valda has been on this list for a long time. It's always in that top yield group. Just a little bit more risk on the lodging with Valda. All right, last slide with some numbers on it. The purpose of this is just to highlight Rothsay a little bit more. So it was released 2022. This last year was basically registered seed, certified seed production. So this year, certified seed growers have it for seed increase. It performed very well in our trials this year. I've been using it as a check. And as I walk the plots, it's real easy for my eye to pick out, oh, this is Rothsay, it's standing well. And then you look at the yield numbers, and I get pretty excited about this one. I think it's going to be hard for us to beat it. And when I look at other genetics, so I'm not showing you any next variety. I don't know what our next variety is going to be, because the bar for us is pretty high right now for Torgy and Rothsay, so it's probably something that's in our third year yield trials right now, which means we won't have a new release until at least 2024, more likely 2025. So we definitely don't have a release for 23. So yeah, it's probably we're probably 2 years away from our next release. So just to highlight Rothsay again. So here we're sorted by 3-year yield, and this is the northern locations again only. So Rothsay is topping this group. So this group of varieties is the most popular ones based on acreage this last year, and I've also included Linkert in there as well. I guess Shelley, yeah, it's basically the most popular varieties. So Rothsay is the top yielder out of this group. One negative, the heading date, I wish it were a little earlier. I know everybody likes an earlier variety versus a later one. It's definitely later than average, and the latest one on here. And this heading date does correlate fairly well with maturity. So it's going to be a few days later than the Westbred varieties. Again, the straw strength is really good. The disease package is good. There's other things that are better, but overall it's pretty good. Compare that with Torgy. Torgy's a little bit stronger on diseases, a little bit better protein, but it doesn't have the straw strength that Rothsay is going to have. So that's all on varieties. And the last slide, I've got one more. This is to acknowledge all of our cooperators at different sites across The state, this is my group. They don't all work on wheat. I advise on some other breeding programs. So I've got a few extra folks on there as well. Everybody else on here works on wheat with us. And the last slide is acknowledging our funding. So Wheat Research and Promotion Council, that's roughly 1/3 of our operating budget. So it's a very significant part. So that's your wheat checkoff dollars coming through the Wheat Research and Promotion Council. The U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, that's been in place for about 25 years now. That funds our FHB screening and also general breeding support. We have a new federal grant that's funding a master's student that's studying a new semi-dwarfing gene that we've had in our program for a number of years, and it's in some of, or most of our newer varieties, including Rothsay and Torgy. And I think that's, I've been selecting for that gene with my eye versus other genes, and we're trying to figure out why that is. So it has some advantage over previous semi-dwarfing genes that we've been using. And then finally, from the state, the Ag Experiment Station is general support, and the Minnesota Small Grains Initiative, which funds disease resistance breeding and general support as well. So that's basically 3 buckets where our funding is coming from. So with that, I'll stop and happy to take any questions. All right, one question.
Maybe 2.
Maybe 2.
Do you have any seeding rate recommendations for Rothsay, or is that?
For seeding rate recommendations, so we did a trial in 2022 where we looked at Rothsay at a little bit higher rate. So we went from 1.3 million plants per acre to I think 1.7. Didn't see a whole lot of difference. In our hands, I've never seen a big difference in yield changing seeding rate. And I don't know if that's because we're doing small plot research and it doesn't really show through. Melissa Carlson has done seeding rate trials over the years. I don't think you ever saw a big yield. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we went down to, we did a lot of trials at 1 million, and 1 million seemed to always be the same as 2 million plants per acre.
Yeah. For a weaker straw variety, and we're like for Lang, we're recommending, so I know there's organic growers growing Lang, we're recommending 0.9 million on Lang. That helps out the lodging. Maybe you're losing 1 or 2 bushel per acre, but if it helps it stand better, it's probably worth it. Rothsay, I would say, is one that can tolerate a little higher rate, but Rothsay tillers fairly well too. So I think that's why we're not seeing a lot of payoff with the higher rate. So everything is at 1.3 unless the company specifically designated a different seeding rate. So that you can find all of that detail in the book. So if you look at that QR code, you can see what the seeding rate for every variety was. But most of them are at 1.3 million.
You know, a lot of fungicides, they seem like they're a flash in the pan. 2 weeks, 2 years, and all of a sudden it's like, we gotta find something new again. Is Maribus Ace gonna be one of those, or do you think it's gonna hold on for a while?
A flash in the pan for scab?
Like fungicide.
Yeah, well, is it because other fungicides are coming out that are better, or do you think that the older fungicides aren't working as well?
That's what I'm asking you.
I think the new ones are better. Yeah.
So with Maribus Ace, if you're gonna put the money out there for fungicide, if you had 10% flowering and you have 5 days, is that the time to be throwing it on? Because I mean, you could have flowering in the afternoon some years.
Yeah. So early anthesis. So as much as I guess I would wait until some of those later tillers are at anthesis. So then your main tillers are maybe a few days out, and you would still protect those main tillers, but you're going to get some of the later ones as well. So that's how I would use that window, is delay your application a little bit to try to catch as many spikes at anthesis as possible.